All right. Hello. Welcome back to another rendition of Lapis Lazuli mixing and just going through this one project bit by bit. A couple quick reminders before we get going, as I like to do every time. This is just for this style of song. This is just for this type of song. If you're working on a different type of song, you may have to adjust things. This is just a good starting point to get going with. So don't, take this necessarily as a gospel, but it's definitely a good way to get started because once again, I use a lot of settings to start with if I'm doing something in a similar style or doing metal or whatever, and then move on from there. I'm going to move on to drums now. This is not about composing or arranging any drum parts. This is not about recording drum parts, as I am not using live drums for this particular track. I don't have the budget for it, and I don't have the capability to do so. So I use a sampler called Easy Drummer, which you will see in a bit, and you've probably heard of before. Actually, I'll show you right now if it pops up for me. There we go. I use Easy Drummer, the Metal Machine EasyX. There is other versions of this. I do like TuneTrack's products, and I just use the basic Easy Drummer because I bought it a couple of years ago, and I haven't really felt the need to upgrade it personally. So, but there are a lot of other options out there. This cost me about $170 total, because there's the basic one that you can get for about $79, and I think this maybe it was only like $100. So if you have $100 or have Christmas coming up or what have you, feel free to purchase that. I like Easy Drummer because you're able to split it out into 8 tracks worth of stuff, which isn't quite enough. I mean, ideally, I would like all the toms to be separate, but fortunately, the way Easy Drummer works is they pre-process a lot of it, so you don't necessarily have to mess with it as much as you might with another thing. I will, at a later date, do a live drum session, as I have some live drum tracks that I've been working with, but for now, we're just going to use these. Other options that you have are things called sound fonts, which are just sample sets. There's a lot of good ones on the internet. Hammersound.net, which I think is still a thing you can go to look up sound fonts, and you can download Short Circuit, SFZ Player. There's a lot of things working with sound fonts that you can use to make your drum tracks. And you find those, and what you do if you want to do this is basically you have to make a MIDI track for each of these and then export it. I just wanted to get you into that because to me it's very important that you get the sounds out so that even if they are pre-processed sounds, you can adjust them for the mix. Because even if it's the most punchy sounding kick drum in the world, it may not fit your mix and you need to do some EQ with it. And I will go into that in a bit. The other thing I want to mention is that this is important techniques for when you have drums with varying velocities, aka different strengths of which they hit, which I find to be very important, to the point of I make it easier by playing all my drum parts, quote unquote. I use a keyboard to do so. Not everybody does, and that's fine. So there's a lot of different methods which you can do that. I just want to make sure you all know that that's what I'm working with before I get going, because results may vary, especially with something as complicated as drum kit. And drum kits are very complicated. This may end up being split into 3 episodes. I'm not sure yet, but I'm just going to do a giant session because I feel like that'd be the most cohesive, and I'll try to keep an eye on my clock and split it wherever. We're already at 4 minutes, and I've just been describing what I'm doing and what the differences might be. But those are very important, and I did not want to overlook them. So, moving on, we're going to start with the bass drum, the kick drum, and we're going to kind of do a giant overview of it, because you see that I'm doing a lot of things. Because in this style, you really want your drum. Again, if you're doing a different style, you may do less or more processing. But for this, I have it going to 2 different buses. One is a compressor that's on the bass, and that means that basically this hit comes through that compressor before the bass gets compressed or anything. So it makes it so that the low end, you get the strike of this no matter what, even if the bass is playing at the same time. It just helps this stick out a little bit more and helps make sure that the low end, which is got a lot of sonic energy, stays controlled. Because if you don't do that, again, it's going to be very difficult to to do, you know, make sure things work. And I just want to show you here. This is an EQ I'm using. I'm using notably a different EQ, and this is a preset that I made a while ago. And I don't always use this because, again, this is a pre-processed kick drum from EZdrummer. But what I like to do is roll off just a little bit on the bottom end, just for this style. Like if you're doing a bigger, you know, dancier thing, you probably don't want to do that. But just roll off a little bit at 24. And then beef up just a touch at 60, just so it's got a really nice kick. And sometimes you don't even need that. Again, it depends on how fast the style is. But for something big where the kick drum really needs to have that blah, then do that. And then just a little dip here. Just once again, this is where guitars happen a lot as well, and a bunch of other deals. So I would advise cutting this a little bit, but results may vary. Some kick sounds don't need that because they already are pre-processed. This one did need a little bit of that just to help things cut through. This is, again, just to get out of the way of other sounds. And there's a lot of like weird honkiness that happens on most recordings of kick drums. And be liberal with this in metal style because realistically you're just going to want blah, blah. Don't do it too much though. Just you want to make sure it sounds like as natural a kick drum as possible. And touch of a peak right here at around 3,000 hertz, 3 kilohertz if you will, just to punch it up. And you may need to this. If you're getting a live sound, you may have a lot of bleed from the kick mic. It depends. But if you don't, you won't need to really do it too much low pass because it's usually self-correcting in that way. Kick drum mics don't really pick up this frequency range. But that's how you can get the transient that of the kick to really come out there. So that's what I'm doing with the kick drum EQ wise. And I've kind of left it up here so that you can see it. And there's that. That's one big thing. The other big thing is, and again, especially if you have the varying velocities, is a compressor on the kick drum. And a compressor is, as mentioned before, but real quick recap, is kind of like a fire hose or a nozzle on a hose where you've got a set amount of sound coming through and you want to do it. For kick drum, if you notice, and let me pull this back down here. If you notice over here how there's the sound, and I'll zoom that in even more actually, you can see this is a basic kick drum hit where it's got a really sharp hit and then it goes, it doesn't really have much. So what you really want to do is, and then this is in milliseconds, so keep that in mind. But what you want to do is, depending on how thwacky your kick drum is and how much hit it has, you want to really have a pretty quick attack. And honestly, this is a pretty quick attack. I mean, remember, this is milliseconds. So this is let's see, this is 0.05 of a second. So, you know, that gives you an idea. And the same, and release time is, you know, this is when the compressor activates and knows it has to start working. This is when the compressor deactivates and doesn't have to work as much. Depending on the style, if you want a big kick, you want the release time to be pretty long because then it'll just stay on. It'll make things more even. It'll expand out the parts that, you know, you can see again over here, where you have that little blah. So you want it bigger. For me, I wanted a pretty quick one because there were parts in this song that didn't really warrant to have a giant kick drum sound. Not all, don't worry about this. Not all compressors have that. That's just this one. You want it really heavy. Some compressors go super high. Honestly, I wouldn't suggest past 6 to 1, which means that for every 1 decibel over the whatever the threshold is, you can set thresholds on some compressors, like say, a certain decibel level. And so for every point past the threshold, and there's just basically a set threshold that you drive into on this particular compressor, which, I mean, this is a pretty hefty kick drum as it is. It's, you know, getting pretty high, as you saw over here. You know, that's about -6 decibels right there. So that's pretty hot. So you don't really need to drive the compressor too much. But basically this means that for every 1 that it tries to go over, it brings it down 4.68 decibels. So that means that, you know, it just evens out the sound a little bit more, because what you do is you balance it to where The output is correcting for what the input drive is, so you can drive it more if you have, if for some reason like the kick drum signal looked more like this, you know, and it was really small, you'd want to drive up the input a lot more. But if it looks like that, then you're going to want to make sure the input is up a little bit more. And so so that's, you know, just one thing you want to keep an eye on, because yeah, you can see where my kick drum, because it's pre-processed and I can control the levels from with an easy drummer, it drives a lot more. So that's why you have that like that. And that's very important, like especially if there's a lot of varying dynamics, because yes, you want dynamics in the playing for most styles, because if you don't have that, it sounds plastic, it sounds fake, it sounds boring, and that's what you want to avoid. But too many dynamics means that when you go into mastering or you're just trying to get a good level, every single point in the song sounds gross. And, you know, you don't have to use a compressor. I mean, what you could do is go over to the volume, and this is, if you click on this, so you can go over to the volume, and if you click on this, you know, right here for the automation, or you can basically just like go in individually and do it. But that would take a long time. Knowing how to work a compressor takes a lot less time, and so you don't have to worry about it. So that's important. That's important on almost every single drum. Again, some pre-processing is fine. I don't do it as much on toms always because I like a really open tom sound. But I mean, if you listen to Disturbed's Down with the Sickness, there's a frig ton of compression on all his drums. So that's just something that's really, really important that you really need to make sure that you do. Let's see. So I want to make these episodes about 15 minutes long, and it's already been 12 minutes, and I'm already just into the kick drum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the snare for now, but that's important. Oh, I have one more thing to talk about, actually. So I talked about the compressor that's on the kick drum itself to make sure that it's more even. Because otherwise, like, you can kind of hear where it pulses a little bit, and those were more pronounced when I didn't have the compressor on. I mean, again, the EQ is pretty subtle, so, you know, whatever. So that's that. And one more thing is I put the bass, the snare, and the kick through a side chain, or parallel compression, and this compressor is basically, oh, hey, let's have that look there. You can see some of it. Let me just, boom, boom, there we go. Okay, so this compressor here, this is a specific model. A lot of things have a 76 modeler. Basically, super heavy compressor, no, that's the 20-to-1 ratio. You can use any compressor you want, but this one has a certain color to it. And this one is another one that just basically drives. You don't want as much of an attack with this one, honestly. You just want it to compress. Or actually, I'm sorry, this is in reverse. So you want the attack as fast as possible, the release as fast as possible, and then just so it's like really, really just the heaviest compression you can imagine. Because this soloed sounds like, you know, ridiculous. It just sounds crazy. And I mean, if I added the bass in it, it'd even be more ridiculous, but it's like, there's no dynamic variation. And the reason I like doing that is because it helps, again, even out the sound. So what you can do is you kind of put this in a little bit so it fattens up the sound without affecting the dynamics, because you don't want to use too much compression. Otherwise, it sounds lifeless and dead. So you just kind of want to use a lot of different techniques combined in order to get your drums sounding successful. So that's it for the kick drum. And again, I only want to make these episodes about 15 minutes long, so I'm going to move on to the snare now, and I might have to, just because of the way my time's working out today, do another session later. But yeah, so that's the kick drum. That's the big overview of how I work with it. And that'll generally be the way you want to work with it when you're using a clean recorded track, like from a sampler, or if you have a really good studio that can record really separate sounding drums. Again, that's not always the case. Again, there's other techniques you can use, but, you know, generally speaking, that's not the case. All right.